All right, thanks for staying with us on the show. You just saw the face of the eagle there as we join him on his show today. Dane Waters brings us around the world with him on the program today. Dane, it's your floor and we're with you on it. Good morning.
Good morning. Oh, it's my floor. That's a very scary concept, you know. Good morning, Shion. How are you? I'm going to call you S because, you know, I can't ever say anything. Like Q, you know, James Bond, he has Q. You're the Q. You're my Q. You're the S. So anyway, good morning. Welcome to Around the World with Dane Waters. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited for the show to get started. And first, I want to say I appreciate the opportunity with Silverbird Studios. But let's talk about the show for a second before we get started about the topics we're going to discuss. The show is here to help people understand what's going on around the world other than what's in their backyard. You know, too much around the world, everyone is thinking, okay, all I care about is what's happening in my sandbox and around the world. But this is going to be a show that tells you what's happening in the remotest part of the world, how it impacts you. It's going to be about trust, transparency, debate, dialogue, and education. And so it's going to be an exciting show, and I look forward to the opportunity to talk to everyone around the world about it. So let's get started. I think the first thing we're going to talk about is what's going on in the United States with Donald Trump. And so I'm going to take a couple of minutes and just talk about that. And S, whenever you want to jump in, please jump in. So, you know, I definitely want to hear you, what you have to say. But, you know, a lot of what we talk about around the world, people say originates in the United States. What happens in the United States impacts the rest of the world. And you know, as an American, some people would say that may be like egotistical, but the reality is there is a lot of influence about what happens in the U.S. around the world. So who is president of the United States is going to have a tremendous impact, I think, on the next generation. We have Donald Trump and we have Joe Biden, but let's talk specifically about Donald Trump for a second. As we all know, as the whole world knows, there was an assassination attempt against the president, a former president. And let me just be very clear. There is no place on this planet for any type of assassination attempt against any politician, whether you hate them, no matter what, whether they're a tyrant, whether they are rogue, no matter what they're doing, there is no place for political assassinations in this world. You know, we must live in a world where people have the opportunity to speak their mind. Freedom of speech is one of the most fundamental freedoms we have. And, you know, there are other ways that we can deal with if we are unhappy or dissatisfied with what's happening. Donald Trump, honestly, listen, if he had turned his head a millimeter the other way, he wouldn't be with us today. And there's just no justification for this violence. And as you have seen, you know, around the world, you know, as far as every leader, major leader around the world has weighed in, most of them, whether it's Macron or whether it's Starmer of the UK or whether it's the Mexican leader or whomever, they always talk about how, what we just talked about, how there's no place for this type of violence anywhere in the world. It's the antithesis to democracy and freedom. It just simply is. But you know, one interesting comment came from the Russian Foreign Ministry, where they said that, you know, instead of using money to fund Ukraine, they should use the funds to better security in the United States so these things don't happen. I find that quite interesting, you know, how that is their perception. They always, you know, listen, they're amazing spin doctors. There's no doubt about it. Other interesting comments have come from like Argentina, where the president there talks about how, you know, this is about how the anti-democratic forces are trying to stop Donald Trump. You know, basically trying to blame it on the Democrats in the United States. So anyway, the point is, you know, what we do know is that A, there's no place for this anywhere in the world, especially in the United States. Number two is, what do we know about why this happened? You know, even after 3 days, there is still no motive as to why a 20-year-old boy in the United States decided to crawl up on the top of a roof and try to assassinate Trump. There's just no reason or rationale for it. And nothing has been found in his social media. Nothing's been found about with his friends. So, you know, hopefully one day we'll figure out exactly what prompted this to happen. Number two is, what has it done to Donald Trump? As we've been talking about, or as talked about earlier in the show, the Republican National Convention has started. Donald Trump has said that he was saved by God, and that this has really changed his focus on what he's going to talk about at the convention. He talks about unity. He talks about the need for unity. And I will say the one thing that was very paramount in the United States was the fact that you had both President Biden and Trump both come out and talk about how we must be united as a country and that there's no place for this. But the one thing I will say that is interesting is, is his vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance. While we have Trump talking about the need for unity and Biden talking about the need for unity, his new vice presidential pick, J.D. Vance, who's 39 years old, is out there talking and blaming it's because of the vitriol caused by the Democrats. So I find that quite interesting that, Donald Trump, who's talking about unity, has chosen a vice presidential candidate who makes these types of accusations. And the last thing I'll say before we go to our first segment about our topic today is that, J.D. Vance, who has been chosen, who's nominated, he'll be one of the youngest vice presidents ever if he's elected. But I think he was chosen for two very specific reasons. One is that he's an attack dog. I mean, he's the future of MAGA, Make America Great Again. He's the future. He absolutely, totally, 100% embraces what Donald Trump stands for. And that he is the kind of guy who will be the attack dog and go out there and say things that Trump just can't or won't, which is shocking, living in a world where Trump won't say something. But I think he's gotten to the point where he understands this election cycle. He must be a little more tame. So this is what's going to happen. I think you're going to see J.D. Vance out there saying the most controversial things during the campaign. But as of now, because of the assassination attempt, I do believe that Trump is the odds-on favorite once again to win the presidency, which is what we'll talk about in future shows. Now, that's my intro and my rambling. And today's show, because it's important to understand how all these major conflicts fit together, we're going to talk about the Middle East and what's going on in the Middle East. And I think that, once again, this is the first time I've actually ever anchored the show, for lack of a better term, so I'm probably going to screw up technically on how all this stuff fits together, so bear with me. So let's talk. Esther, are you still there? Or did I lose you?
Absolutely. And then maybe before we move to Middle East, I'm very curious. You just dropped one or two things about J.D. Vance and the fact that Vance, I beg your pardon, and the fact we all know that he's been a very great critic of so many things, Donald Trump, and his choice just made us know that now for the MAGA movement, he may be the next generation, the next face for it. But more than anything, I would like to hear your thought regards to the fact that Mrs. Melania Trump was conspicuously absent at Milwaukee's nomination of her husband. I don't know what that would mean for his re-election bid.
Well, Melania, first of all, as First Lady, was not exactly the most loved First Lady. Her presence on the campaign trail, I argue, is not the most important. Many people argue that that the relationship is strained. So it is a little unfortunate that she wasn't there. I mean, typically, you want to show, especially in the Republican world, about family values. But I think you'll see her at some point in time during the convention, because it was kind of unscripted for him to walk out on the stage like he did yesterday. So I do think that she'll show up. But I once again don't believe that her presence on the campaign trail is that important to garner women vote, because she's not exactly personified as representative of the kind of the female vote that Donald Trump needs. So, but today I have a very special guest, a gentleman that I've known for quite a long time by the name of Gareth Brown. Gareth is a reporter for The Economist. He's been in the Middle East for a long time. I know when you see him, you're going to realize he's 12 years old, but he's definitely knows more than I'll ever know about the Middle East and what's going on. And he's currently writing a book about the Middle East and what's going on specifically when it comes to Lebanon. So anyway, welcome, Gareth. And let's have a nice little chat about what's going on. So, Gareth Brown, assuming he's here.
Get him join us in just a moment. A lot of people are asking Dane about updates on the Israeli Hezbollah, conflict, which of course takes everybody to Lebanon. We can't wait for Gary to give us updates because, as you said, he knows better than most of us here on what is going on around that area. Dane?
I just saw him. I think he just walked away. There he is. Gareth, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh my God! You know what? Thanks a lot for dressing up for the show. I appreciate it today. You're always a man of great taste. Well, that's debatable. Anyway, Gareth, welcome to the show. Around the World with Dane Waters. Yours truly here. It's good to see you. So let's just jump into this because we have I think 7 minutes to really get into this. I want to talk about. First of all, where are you? You're actually in Beirut these days?
Beirut, yes. Correct.
Okay. Well, do me a favor and kind of give us an overview about, a lot of conversations taking place about, Israel, Hamas, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis, and what's going on in the region. By the way, Gareth and I met when I was living and working in Beirut, so it's an area that I'm very fond of as well. But kind of give us an update on what is the latest between the peace deal, the proposed peace settlement between Israel and Hamas.
I mean, I think we have to look back at, there's a historical perspective which goes back 9 months since the October 7th attacks that Hamas launched on southern Israel, and then there's a perspective which goes way back beyond that. I'd start by saying at the minute, it feels like we're quite far away from any sort of ceasefire in Gaza, and I think we saw a brief cessation of hostilities at the end of last year between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And that was, basically premised on a hostage exchange, Hamas releasing some of the, more than 300 hostages that they took from Israel when they attacked in October. Now, there is, Hamas is still holding at least 120 Israeli hostages, and there is potential for an agreement. I think Hamas probably are quite militarily fatigued by the 9 months of war. They've lost a lot of fighters, no doubt. There's signs that there's sort of brewing dissatisfaction at them in Gaza, and we've all seen the images of Gaza. We've seen it's a humanitarian catastrophe. The Gaza Strip is on the precipice of famine. Huge parts of it have been destroyed, many people displaced. I think the difference now between the possible ceasefire and the one that took place sort of briefly last year is that Hamas are insistent that any ceasefire that comes now is essentially an end of the war. And this is a key part of the negotiations. And Israel wants the right to resume the war. I mean, the Israelis have basically said openly, we're going to do this ceasefire, we're going to do this deal, get our hostages back, and then go back to war and finish off Hamas. And that is an agreement that Hamas is simply not going to deal with. We had this big strike in Gaza in the Al-Mawasi region, which happened on Saturday, where Israel said it targeted Mohammed Daith, who would be sort of the chief of staff for Hamas's military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades. Now, there's no confirmation that he's dead yet, but generally speaking, when we see these particularly violent incidents on the ground in Gaza, they lead to a breakdown in the peace talks, the negotiations which are happening in Egypt and Qatar with the help of Qatari and Egyptian mediators. But that hasn't happened yet. David Barnier, who's the head of Mossad and one of the key Israeli interlocutors in these negotiations, is still, he's supposed to be in Doha this week. So it's too early to say, but we've had so many times in the last 6 months where it's looked like we were getting close to an agreement, close to a deal, and it hasn't happened for various reasons. And we can get into that, why there hasn't been a deal and what's blocking that. But I would be very skeptical until it actually happens, because we've heard so many times that this is imminent, this is going to happen, whatever.
So I appreciate that. What I want to know, this in Nigeria, where this is primarily broadcasting, there are a lot of Lebanese, a huge Lebanese community in Nigeria. There's a lot we can talk about who is responsible for October 7th. Were the Israelis complicit? Were they not? I mean, all this kind of stuff. But there was a poll that came out, I think, last week that said that 75% of Israelis are ready for Netanyahu to resign either now or post-war. So the question to you would be that, okay, let's say that, what Hezbollah has said is that if there's a ceasefire, we will stop, our activity. Number one, do you think that that's the case? And number two is, if there is a ceasefire, which I agree with you, I think is far, far away. If there is a ceasefire, though, what will happen? Will Netanyahu and the Israelis immediately attack Lebanon, or what do you think is the sequencing of events post the ceasefire?
Yeah, I think if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, then it gives you a window. It gives you a window for perhaps not a diplomatic solution in between Israel and Hezbollah, but it gives you a window to avoid a wider war. I mean, you could already say that this war is happening in South Lebanon. More Hezbollah fighters have been killed in this war than in the previous war they fought in 2006, which was devastating for Lebanon. So in some regards, it's already happening. Now, how do you prevent a wider war? How do you prevent the Israelis, taking out infrastructure across Lebanon, including in Beirut, or even an Israeli ground incursion? And Hezbollah have said at multiple levels, multiple times, look, I think, even in his most recent speech, Hassan Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, he said, as soon as there is a ceasefire, as soon as the war stops in Gaza, this front, as it's known, the northern front to the Israelis, will go quiet as well. So I think there's the hope that by getting this sort of, whether it's an actual ceasefire or just a dampening down of hostilities, I think the Israelis seem to think that if they just lower the intensity of the war in Gaza, that would be sufficient to get Hezbollah into this sort of diplomatic process. Now, whether or not that is the case sort of remains to be seen. But I think if you can get a ceasefire in Gaza, you'll stop the imminent risk of a wider conflagration between Hezbollah and Israel. But that doesn't change the fact there are, I think on the border between Israel and Hezbollah, there is an unstoppable force and an immovable object. And frankly, you have about 60,000 Israelis displaced from their homes in the north and a lot more Lebanese displaced from their homes in the south. The Israelis talk about wanting to create a buffer zone. So perhaps the first 5 to 10 kilometers of the border is, basically it's going to be impossible for any Lebanese to live there. There's dozens of villages which have been completely destroyed. Tens of thousands of Lebanese have been forced from their homes in the south. So, it's all well and good avoiding the war for now, but how do you change the fundamentals, which, many Israelis see a war between Israel and Hezbollah in the next 10 years as inevitable. So how do you change that apparent inevitability? You have to find some sort of diplomatic agreement. That's a lot harder to imagine because Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon, they're not some sort of foreign occupying army. If you look at, they published the names of the fighters who have been killed since October 7th. They're all from those villages in the south. It's an organic army in the south. So you can, what are you going to do? You're going to move people out of their villages? It doesn't make any sense. These are not people who have come from Syria or from Iraq or from the north of Lebanon. They are sort of local organic members of Hezbollah from those villages in which they are being killed. So it makes it very difficult to kind of foresee a Hezbollah withdrawal, which the Israelis are so insistent on. So you would need some sort of creative diplomacy. But in my mind, there's no chance of a ceasefire as long as the war in Gaza, of a ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel as long as the war in Gaza is going on.
Well, I think it's important to point out to the audience that Hezbollah's existence. Hezbollah exists, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is because they do not believe of Israel's right to exist, correct? So, if that is their premise, they don't believe in Israel's right to exist as their primary premise, it seems like, war would be inevitable at some point in time. And the last question I'll have for you, because I know you're going to go as well, is that where does Iran fit into this? The new elections in Iran, do you think that they're going to be more proactive in pushing Hezbollah or is the moderate who was elected going to try to rein in Hezbollah in some way?
I think that's unlikely. To go back to Hezbollah's raison d'etre, you have to remember that they were born out of Israel's occupation of South Lebanon. Israel occupied South Lebanon for nearly 20 years, withdrew in 2000, and that's, if we're looking at the origins of Hezbollah, this is a resistance to Israel's occupation. Now, since then, it's obviously grown into this, this sort of beast which has been active in, various civil conflicts around the region. In terms of the Iranian elections, look, it's true that Iran's new president is more moderate, but you also have to, take note of the the structural situation in Iran, and it's the supreme leader and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps who really run that, and they manage the relationship with Hezbollah. And I think especially, a few years back when we saw the Americans assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the infamous IRGC general in Baghdad, I think you saw a change in the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. And okay, Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy, but it's more than that. It's also a Lebanese organization. And I think if you take the role of Hassan Nasrallah as a sort of political advisor or something like that, it's a two-way thing. You know, this is not just a case of Iran or the IRGC says jump and Nasrallah says how high. I think there's as much advice going from Nasrallah and Hezbollah to the Iranians to the IRGC as there is the other way. So I think to put your hope in a moderate or a reformist civilian president to rein in Hezbollah is very, very unlikely. So I don't see it changing so much. I think fundamentally, you know, there's always a risk of wider regional conflagration. But I think fundamentally, like the immediate concerns of conflict should be seen from a Lebanese perspective, a Lebanese Hezbollah perspective, and an Israel Hezbollah perspective. This is where the you know, this is where the real tension lays. This is where the real kind of risk of conflagration is. And I don't think a reformist civilian president in Tehran has the ability or even the mandate to rein any of the IRGC proxies in. That's just not how the system works. You know, think of it like an octopus, but the octopus can be activated from the tentacles, not just from the central body. You know, it's it's an octopus with 8 brains in a way.
Oh, okay, I appreciate that. Last question: do you think Bibi is going to survive in all of this? What's going to happen to him?
I think he will survive. I mean, he's one of the most canny political operators in not just in Israeli history, but Middle Eastern world history, and he's always found a way to bounce back. You know, it's true he's very unpopular among certain parts of society in Israel, but I would also say there's still people that do like him. You know, that's him. He's Israel's Trump in a way. He's very polarizing. The people hate him, absolutely hate him, and the people that like him see him now more than ever as sort of Israel's savior. I mean, you know, he's obviously facing a lot of corruption charges, and I think the worry is that if you know, it's been sort of widely speculated and reported and analyzed that he is the one scuttering a ceasefire in Gaza, a potential ceasefire, because the end of the war would mean, you know, an investigation into his failings as prime minister and, you know, the potential resumption of his corruption cases. So, or his, you know, there'd be more focus on that. So, you know, there is an argument that it's in his interest to keep the war going, and who knows, you know, but you know, the people he's in government with, you know, these kind of extreme right-wing religious nationalists, I think from their perspective, they're probably not going to get into government again. So whilst they're very vocal about threatening to collapse the government and pull out of his coalition and leave him without a majority in the Israeli parliament, I think they're smart enough to know that this is probably their one shot in government, their one shot to control ministries, to implement this sort of, you know, this religious nationalist vision of Israel that they have. And I don't think you can underestimate that. So I think he's going to be, you know, still prime minister at the end of this year and well into next year. I think he'll be around until the next elections, actually.
Well, Gareth, I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us today. I know you're a busy man. You got a lot to do. So thanks a lot. And we look forward to having you on the show and again in the future. Thanks a lot. Take care. So now, if Shayon, are you there? I think you're still there.
I'm very much here. Very interesting conversation, and to in fact know what the future holds for the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite all of the things, criticisms even within his own folds as to how much the war is taking to get all of the people he feels of threat to his nation. I think it is what it is at this point in time. So nice to hear a lot from Gareth today. As he said, I can't wait to also have him, watch him on your show someday soon, Dane.
Well, great. Well, listen, so now I think we're going to chat. I think we have, what, 4 minutes left? How much time do we have? You're the timekeeper there. So I'd like to go in and well, first of all, I want to say this. You know what today is? There are two major events in the world today, history, you know, today in history. Do you know what happened in 1945?
I couldn't know. I was born several years after. Okay, well, I know that 1945. I remember that. I mean, World War II, a lot of things broke out, and I hope that I remember my history.
Well, in 1945, today in history was the first test of the atomic bomb in Los
Hiroshima
Alamos, New
and
Mexico.
Nagasaki.
No, it was the first test of the bomb, not the dropping of the bomb, the first test of the bomb. So the nuclear age as we know it started today. And I think it's relevant because I do believe that if we're not careful, we're heading into another history of nuclear proliferation. But anyway, let's take a minute or two to talk about what's going on in Kenya and Nigeria and exactly how all this ties together. You know, it's interesting in what's happening in in Kenya from the standpoint of, they had extreme violence. I mean, what happened, President Ruto, what a lot of people don't really understand what's going on in Kenya, there's $76 billion in debt. They're a country that has a lot of opportunity, but they have, like many countries, they're burdened by their debt. And in order to get loans and from other, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they must take in consideration some austerity programs. So what they did was the president put in place a new taxation system. Now, as you imagine, none of us likes taxes. So that in itself caused a lot of controversy on the streets, people protesting. Dozens of people were killed by the military and the police, and the president eventually pulled the bill from consideration. But and then as a way to settle down what's going on there, he decided that he was going to dissolve his entire cabinet except for a couple of people and try to engage the people, the citizens, in trying to put together a new cabinet. Now, the reality there is, he kind of opened up Pandora's box because, politically, from my experience, trying to say, listen, we want to create a government that the people like, you're never going to make anyone happy. So I think this is just delaying the inevitable that there's a possibility of greater violence there. But what we have to understand about Kenya, just like Nigeria and other countries, is that the amount of debt that a country has really relates to its fiscal opportunities for the future. And unless the Kenyans are able to pass some of these austerity programs, the country is headed for an economic disaster from the standpoint that it will not be able to honestly pay its bills. And so this is where the people and government have to come to a truce in Kenya and other parts of the world. Is that, we all must pay the price. We all must suffer the pain. If there's a little bit of taxation, I know for the average person on the street that matters, but if it's the only way for a long-term solution that can better the economy of the country, then, the people have to understand that is the price to pay. Now, in addition to that, I know I saw a videotape of one of the members of the ministry who resigned saying that when they came into power, they were taking bribes and getting fancy watches. Listen, corruption is rampant around the world. I don't care what country you go to, that is always the case. I don't believe that corruption is something that's easily stamped out, but the best way to stamp out corruption is to bring strong economic opportunities into the country, and which is what President Ruto is trying to do. Whether he survives as president for his, the rest of his term, who knows? But many people would argue that he's really trying to fix the wrongs of the previous administrations in that country, and that's very critical. So that's Kenya. So I don't know if you have any specific questions about that, or if you want to talk about that more, or if we're out of time. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, in Africa, the movement in Kenya, as we speak, is of interest to a lot of people who have always seen leadership as the vein of development on this continent. They feel that the action by the youth in Kenya is sending a lot of signals to leaders across the world, especially in Africa, to do the needful. Else they'll find the citizens on the street protesting for better governance across board. Just as you said, we heard the president on Thursday dissolving his entire cabinet, maybe for one particular person who is a close ally of his, who he says that will be staying to help him stabilize what's going on. That actually is Secretary Musalia Mudavadi, a key political ally, who he says will stay in office to work with him and make things work. Now, looking forward to a lot of things that this will bring forth in Africa, especially the sub-region, is another thing for a lot of us to say. But in all of this, maybe the question Nigerians will be asking is, how do all of these affect us one way or the other? What are you hearing across the world? I know what I'm hearing at home. Dane.
Well, listen, what we all must understand is that we as a world that's intertwined to the point that it is, whether it's economically, whether it's militarily, whether it's, geopolitically, we must understand, like for a Nigerian, what matters, for example, if there's global conflict, there's less money by the International Monetary Fund to give, there's less money by the World Bank to give. There's less military support that's going to be given to Nigeria to oppose Boko Haram or whatever the other insurgencies there are in the country. It will impact, if there's a global conflict or the conflict that's going on, it will impact international trade. It will drastically impact international investment. So, all of these things that are happening, whether it's in Kenya, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in China, whether it's in Guyana or Venezuela. I mean, all of these things impact our day-to-day lives. We talk about how, you talk about how COVID, think about this as the international conflict now, like COVID. COVID influenced supply chains, the cost of goods and services, jobs. International conflict is the same as COVID. It really is. It will have the same far-reaching implications. So we must understand that we can't, as a world, just sit around and just say, okay, well, that's happening 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles or 3,000 miles away. I shouldn't worry about it. We all must worry about it because, honestly, it's going to impact whether or not we can buy bread, whether our cost of fuel. It's going to impact everything that impacts us every single day.
Absolutely.
So we all must be aware of what's going on.
Absolutely, Dane. I'm sure you want to say bye for now. We have to go to next week. So let's hear from you.
Well, listen, I once again, this is, I really appreciate the opportunity for the show. It's a great show. Next week, I'm not really sure what we're going to talk about next week. Every week's going to be something new and exciting. But Around the World with Dane Waters, once again, we will look in depth at these issues that will impact us, that you may not think that impact you, but they do impact you. Anyway, thanks a lot for having me today, and I look forward to talking to all of you next week.
I'll break it down to